Welcome again to the Southwest Climate Podcast. Mike Crimmins, long time no see.
Good to see you, Zach. The monthly, I'm doing air quotes, the monthly Southwest Climate Podcast. Yeah, sorry about the infrequency as of late.
I know we'll have to make it a broad apology to our audience, but we really do appreciate some of the emails that we've gotten. It has been like 2.5 months, Mike. I think the last version that we did was right before Thanksgiving, believe it or not. We said last time then that we had lost our producer, and Ben McMahan had gone on to brighter things, and we're still in that state, trying to find a way to continue this at the level of professionalism that Ben brought to it. So here's my appeal to our niche audience. If there's anybody out there who is good with podcasts and has a desire to be our producer on a volunteer basis, Mike and I can pay with beer money, but please reach out to us because we're in the process of figuring out a contingency plan so we can keep coming back and producing this every month instead of every other month.
That's right. The worst case might be an uncut version of Zach and I rambling for 2 hours, which might cause listenership to drop.
Yeah, I'm fighting against that because I do have some sympathy for our audience. No, but anyway, it's been 2.5 months, like I said, Mike. So there's basically the entire winter so far that we have to recap. So we've got a lot to talk about. Good to see you, and we've been communicating, so I know you're doing well. But always good to have a chance to get caught up. Listen to you as well about what the heck has been going on in the Southwest and beyond. So we'll start from the beginning. I'm thinking, Mike, maybe we began at the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago.
You've done paleo work. You always got to lord that over me. Yeah, I don't know anything. I have a goldfish memory. I can barely remember early last week. So.
I could take us from the late Pleistocene through the Holocene. Yeah. But I don't think that's for this podcast.
Probably not. It sounds like those are curse words.
Let's try to recap where we've been for the winter. And I want to talk about sort of the dominant patterns that have led to the observations of precipitation, snowpack, temperature, which we'll talk about. And then transition a little bit. I'm curious, Mike, what has been some surprising features so far this winter? And I've picked out a few, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say. And then, as we are marching right along in the winter, I'd say we're on the second half side of it. We'll look forward for the remaining winter, and maybe prelude a little bit of the spring and late winter. Okay, so coming into the winter, coming out of another generational monsoon.
How many generational monsoons are we going to observe?
Yeah, that term has lost its luster with back-to-back generational monsoons. No, but we're in a good situation. But we had this La Niña event, the triple dip La Niña event, which is relatively rare, not unprecedented, which is what we've experienced, a third La Niña event in a row, and the expectation based on that, which tips our scale, and it's the best thing that we have to go by as a climate scientist. So, we lean heavily into it. The expectation was for the classic La Niña pattern is dry southwest and sort of wetter northwest. That's actually not what's played out, Mike. So
no,
we have actually had a remarkably and I'm going to say the royal we here, I mean, like large swaths of the West, and not just, Arizona and New Mexico and even smaller Tucson. Large swaths of the West have had a pretty wet and vigorous winter season so far. And it's also been cold. I mean, I think if you looked at November, November might have been, the first the only month so far where it looked, in terms of precipitation, where it looked La Nina like. It was relatively dry in the Southwest. Then December, particularly late December, that script flipped, particularly with some atmospheric rivers that came into California and clipped the the northern parts of Arizona and New Mexico, and also like the mountainous areas in the lower deserts in Arizona were above average. In January just blew the doors off what's that metaphor? Blew something away.
Blew the doors
off the car.
Blew the doors off the rain gauge. I don't even know.
And when you smush those 3 months together, it's been a really quite unusual winter from a La Nina standpoint, but one that nonetheless we'll take, and we'll go over the snowpack conditions, but obviously they reflect that. And then broadly speaking, temperature across the West, it's been a mild winter. For most large swaths of the Western U.S., it's been below average temperatures. And honestly, I haven't seen such a mild winter spatially coherent as what we've had so far. And obviously, those two things are related. So, Mike, what stood out to you the most so far of this winter? Are there particular events that have caught your attention? When we look at the big picture, what's the sort of micro version of that?
I was poking around at some of the data. And so we last talked on the podcast in the middle of November. And I don't know if you remember, so we had just a great monsoon, right? So July, August, September. Do you remember how wet October was? Wet? I know, I can't, I couldn't either. I was surprised when I went back and looked at it. There was a lot of rain across parts of Arizona. So once we settled into November, you and I have been for over a decade now talking about the effects of La Nina, triple dip La Nina, third winter of La Nina. It's probably going to start to dry out, and it's going to start pushing us back into that kind of below average precipitation weather pattern. And, even the last two winters, they were dry, but we would squeak out a couple of good winter storms. So it wasn't like we scraped the bottom of the barrel like some of the past, like really bad kind of La Nina winters. I'm thinking like 2017, 2018 stands out in my mind. So November actually wasn't that wet. There was like maybe an event or two, and much of Arizona and parts of New Mexico ended up being maybe close to average for the northern parts of the state, but the southern parts of both of the states were below average to, if not very dry. So it was like actually quite dry. So we roll into December, and I don't know if you remember this, but right around the first week of December, the atmospheric river story was really starting to come online for California, right? They were getting hammered, and there was events in November, there was events in December. Some of those events were actually, they would sag south. And to get an atmospheric river to really hit inland to Arizona, you've actually got to thread the marine layer, which is that soupy air at the surface, through the Baja coastal range of California. You've got to actually squeak it through there. We ended up having a long duration, like over 24 hours, if not 48 hours, rainfall event that was very, very warm. It was like in the 60s. The dew points actually came up into the 60s. This is in December for Arizona. So we were above monsoon threshold for a couple of days, and then it rained like bananas over southern Arizona in a consistent stripe from like Oregon Pipe National Park up through Casa Grande and then up into the White Mountains of Arizona, and then it extended into New Mexico. It actually looked like some of the rain events of June, and it flooded out Casa Grande. They ended up having in the wintertime enough, they had several inches of rainfall, and then they ended up having wintertime desert flooding. So it wasn't the kind of flooding that happens when you get 3 inches, in 2 hours of a rainstorm. It was 3 inches over like 24 hours. And then they had water flowing through the streets. So that really caught my attention. And it was so warm. The snow levels were 10,000 feet and higher, and didn't actually do any snowpack. So that was like the first event that really started to put some additional precip down that we'd already accumulated in the summer and fall into the early winter season was then. And then the activity, it persisted. A couple more events. They started getting colder. They started getting a little bit more widespread. By the end of the month, we ended up having a handful of really good winter storms that were widespread across Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and started to put down the big higher elevation snowpack. And if you remember, right around New Year's, it was the holiday season here. The Southwest was cool, below average temps, and we were seeing snow accumulating up on the peaks all across Arizona.
I am now remembering October, and I remember October because it was like, oh, wow, the monsoon is still here in October.
That's right. You remember we were arguing whether that was monsoon or not?
Yeah, I do remember that. And just adding some data, November in Tucson, there was no rainfall at the airport in November. There was a trace amount or a small amount at the international airport in Phoenix for November. As you got further north, there was a couple events of small amounts in Flagstaff. Same for Albuquerque, and when you go all the way over to El Paso, it was just one really really small event there. So just to say that November was sort of that dry month, and then as you noted, yeah, we had like 2 or 3 days of relatively large precipitation amounts in December, and by the end of December we were close to average for that time of year. And then I'm speaking about Tucson right now. Mid-January was another there was 3 days in a row where close to a little bit under to a little bit over a half an inch of rainfall fell, and that pushed us quite a bit above average. And we basically in southern southeastern Arizona, or at least in Tucson, we basically haven't experienced a rainfall event in about 3 weeks. So since mid-January was the last event that we have recorded at the National Weather Service and at the airport.
To add on to that too, Zach, though, for January, it has been, even though Tucson kind of fell out of a couple of these storms, we had that really strong run of wet days right in the middle of the month, as you noted there, and Tucson was in on the action. But that was over a week of precip. So it was precipitating somewhere in the Southwest for over a week. It actually continued into New Mexico towards the end of the month, and it's only really dried out across the Southwest kind of briefly towards the end of January. We had another precip event, largely focused on Arizona right at the kind of turn of the end of the month in January. And then even since, we've had a couple of cold fronts come through. They've been much drier, but they've brought some flurries and some higher elevation precip to Arizona and New Mexico. So it's not like we got shut down. It's more like the weather pattern has continued to bring us those storms. Some have had more moisture than others. And it's even like it's November. I'm sorry, it's not November. It's February 9th right now. Kind of looking at the outlook right now, it doesn't look like it's going to shut down for the next 2 weeks even.
So we've had a very active weather pattern.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I remember there being something interesting about that mid-January system. Was it a sort of, it wasn't a cutoff low, it was a closed lower. Do you recall? I remember.
It did. It was actually part of one of the larger atmospheric rivers that hammered California. It was actually coastal west-wide. So it was from Oregon all the way down through the Southern California coast. And it actually extended down Baja. It was just an enormous storm and lots of moisture. And it ended up having an initial storm and then another low kind of dropped out of it. And, we ended up having kind of a couple of impulses come through this mean trough off the West Coast. So the moisture was there. The dynamics continued to kind of pile on each other. And it was just a fantastic couple of days for, lower elevation rain and just, again, some really impressive snow accumulations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah and Colorado. So in California, all the areas that needed some relief as far as precip and especially snow, have really been getting it.
I mean, and I guess to bring in part of the temperature signal story here, it's, you can still see snowpack, outside our window. Like,
I know. Can you remember a winter where we put on snowpack on the Catalinas and it stayed there for weeks?
No, I can't. Yeah. I mean, it has been my memory of these seasons. Like it seems to like be constantly rewritten. So it's like, well, it feels colder, but is my memory just eluding me? But it feels like it's been and the data does bear it out.
It does. Yeah. Like we have, so often what'll happen in the deeper part of the Southwest and kind of southern Arizona, southern New Mexico is that we'll get these snow events and it will quickly warm up. We'll get a ridge behind it and we'll go back up into, the 60s, if not 70. And that snow has trouble hanging on in those conditions. But I think what we're seeing is that there's deep snowpack in the Sky Islands in the southern part of the Southwest. So it's been accumulating. And so even when it warms up for a couple of days, it's taking a while to actually eat down through a couple of feet of snow. And so we continue to see it, which is, again, we don't see that. And, we've actually had base flow in a couple of our creeks in parts of Tucson here running for weeks. Like that again, I do remember past seasons like that, but they're kind of far and few in between.
Well, this is a really good sign for our spring runoff seasons, flow. And we'll get into the snowpack in a little bit, but this is certainly a welcome sign for our water situation and all the impacts that are associated with that, like fire season, which we've talked a lot, drought and whatnot. So somewhat unexpected, not unprecedented, but a good picture. Let me put some numbers on it. I'm looking at the statewide precipitation ranks and temperature ranks. So this is for the November, December, and January 3-month period. Statewide averages. We have in this record from NOAA, there's 128 years of data. So Arizona, in terms of precipitation averaged over the state, is 98th out of 128. So in the upper, 75th percentile, somewhere around there. California is 117th wettest on record out of 128. So what would that be? 9th? Wettest on record. I gotta flip these. Nevada, it's the 3rd wettest on record, and Utah, believe it or not, those skiers up there loving it, is the 7th wettest on record. New Mexico is sort of like right around average, a little bit above average, so 70th out of 128. And then again, like I talked about in the beginning, sort of the La Niña sort of canonical pattern would have the Pacific Northwest. The anomalies would be higher in the Northwest than they would be in the Southwest, if I can say it like that. And that's not the case. Actually, it's below average, or near and below average in terms of ranks up in Washington and Oregon and also Idaho and Montana. So sort of a little flip of the script a little bit, but let's, if you look at this spatial map of precipitation, right, like what you basically see is that atmospheric river signature across the West, right? Like it is, I mean, you can almost just see it right there. A few storms, maybe more than a few, but it's really a product of, a 3-week period where there was just this parade of really juicy storms, that came in and dropped a whole bunch of rainfall and across the West, but a whole bunch of rainfall in California. So before moving on to that, so temperatures, we've been, like I said, statewide average on the cooler side. Arizona ranks 39th, coldest out of 128. California is 30th. Nevada is 28th. Utah is 31st, and New Mexico is a little bit above average So it's 81st coldest. So it's closer to the warmer side than the colder side. So wetter and colder has been the story of the first 3 months. Like the pattern, as we've noted, it hasn't been persistently wet. November was on the drier side, but really in December and through the first half of January really picked up that rainfall and produced a lot of rain and snowpack. Anything else you want to add to that picture, Mike, before moving on to snowpack?
Yeah, just say that probably one of the discussion points is that, wait a minute, you guys said it was going to be drier than average. So what gives, right? So we, as you mentioned earlier, we kind of all in the climate science community who endeavor to provide information at the sort of seasonal outlook timescale. We use seasonal outlooks. The official ones are produced by NOAA Climate Prediction Center. They're state of the art, and they really do leverage the state of El Nino or La Nina in the Pacific. And if we know that status in the fall, then that gives us really a statistical indication of whether or not we're going to observe wetter or drier. But the thing is that's the operative word, right? It's statistical. It's based largely on past conditions, and it's not 100%. So we, the third year of a La Nina, it was weakening, and you actually don't. I'm doing as a dance here to try to cover us, Zach, so we can explain away why we were wrong on the below average forecast here. All La Ninas technically aren't, they don't bring below average precipitation. And that was the tricky thing. And that was always in the back of my mind for the last 3 winters was, we're going to get one of those that squeaked out, average to above average precip. And this has been a rather extreme example of that. NOAA flagged, I was reading one of the ENSO blogs, pointed back to 2016, 2017, which was a weak La Nina event. And it was another crazy atmospheric river year. And the precip anomaly pattern across the Southwest looks almost identical to this year. What's interesting is that was a much weaker La Nina event than the current one. And so, here's one of those events that when we do our statistical analysis of La Nina and El Nino events, it's the little fly in the ointment that makes the correlation just a little bit weaker and gives us less confidence in that kind of pure, La Nina is going to give us drier than average conditions.
Right. On the other hand, the previous 2 winters were La Ninas.
Yep.
And they were drier.
They largely worked out. Yeah.
So it's not a slam dunk. It's not a sure thing. It's always about hedging your bets or.
So we were right 66% of the time over the last 3 winters. So that's pretty good.
I have a hefty dose of skepticism when it comes to these forecasts, and it's not because I don't believe in the underlying mechanisms of them or the physical explanations for them. It's just that I know that it's a complicated system where there's a lot of influences exerting some forces, and there's always a chance that it goes the other way. But I'm looking at the spatial maps of precipitation for the last 2 years, and they kind of looked canonical La Nina, right?
Yeah.
Right. So last year, sort of the really dry epicenter might have been Northern California, Southern Oregon, but across all of Arizona. Well, I'm looking at a map that's sort of spatially average here, so it's hard to tell the granular details. But Arizona and New Mexico were below average. And actually and then the Pacific Northwest, let's say the Western Washington area and Montana and parts of Northern Idaho were all slightly above average. And that is very similar to the year before that.
Yeah.
So, and then I'm looking at a map. I'm looking at the 20 strongest La Nina events since 1950. Yeah, you can find a few of them. 84, 85, Arizona was wet. Parts of 2008, 2009 were wet for Arizona. What one did you say? Oh, the 27 to 2017.
16, 17, yeah.
2008 were wet for Arizona. And which one did you say? 2016?
Yeah, 2016, 2017 was a week. It may not go into the strongest category because it wasn't.
It doesn't. That's why I'm not seeing it here. So I'm just looking at the 20 strongest. So even and there is relationships between strength and the strength of the precipitation signal that you end up seeing. But by and large, it holds dry southwest, but not always. Yeah,
I mean, like, again, for over a decade, we've been talking about if you correlate winter precip against the strength, the breadth of an El Nino index, from strongest to neutral to, strongest El Nino to neutral to strongest La Nina, the correlations are about 0.5 at best, right? So that's 25% of the variance, which is, again, it's not terrible, but it's not perfect.
You have 75% of the variance that is unexplained.
Unexplained, right. So hey, think of that as an opportunity. Like,
well, hey, if you're sitting down playing Texas Hold'em, right? And you're like, I'm going to tell you 25% of, like, how does this work? I actually haven't played in a long time, but like, if I could tell you one of the cards that you don't know, like that would confer an advantage.
Sure. Yeah. Again, it's right. It's and they're skillful. So over time, they actually do have an advantage. But again, it's hard to get your head around some of this stuff. Another point I want to talk about with the precip too across the Southwest is that it has not been monolithic as far as Arizona, New Mexico, all being super wet. So parts of eastern New Mexico have not kind of shared in all this bounty of precip, which kind of makes sense, right? Because you were talking about these atmospheric rivers. Far northern and northwestern Arizona have actually had more precip than the rest of the state because they've been able to catch some of the ones that have been hitting California square. That has faded as you got into eastern New Mexico. So eastern New Mexico is like in the last 60 days, I'm looking at a map here, they've only had about half of normal precipitation, which is, again, they're not a predominantly winter season precip zone, but they're not quite hanging in there at the same level as we are. Parts of kind of central and western New Mexico do better, and then Arizona as a whole, much better shape.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that actually, struck out to me as an interesting part of the pattern, and it sort of raised a question. Like, I mean, eastern New Mexico is sort of in this really enviable wintertime position. I mean, how does it even get rainfall? I mean, it seems like it
doesn't often. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm working on a project right now where I'm looking at precip seasonality across the Southwest. And I kind of knew this, but hadn't really seen it. But so you get the Great Plains has a springtime, summer precip maximum, and their minimum is actually during the winter. So they almost look like kind of a reverse Mediterranean climate where they have this singularity of spring and summer precipitation, and their driest months are actually the middle of the winter.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, if I were to say who's been the, let me call up my map here. Yeah, if I were to say, okay, so wintertime, where have been the geographic locations that have received the least amount of the good fortune from the rainfall and snowpack, and it would be the Pacific Northwest and probably eastern New Mexico. So, and as you say, that's eastern New Mexico. It's not that's sort of what you would expect.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't hurt for it to rain then, but it hasn't been. And yeah, so you're getting a Southern Great Plains kind of Texas drought signal creeping up right now. And like you said, Pacific Northwest they don't actually technically have much drought portrayed on the current drought monitor map up there, but they're running a little bit below average. So like northern Oregon and the northern Rockies have seen kind of not terribly below average precip, but it has been below average. And just like you said, that strike from California right through the central Rockies and extends all the way up into the upper Midwest has been above average with this strong, persistent storm track.
All right. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the very wet period, the atmospheric river period, and that'll sort of take us into the snowpack conditions, because those atmospheric rivers really dominated the snowpack signature as well as the precipitation signal. So grabbing some good information from Daniel Swain's blog on Weather West, there was a really protracted 3-week period where these atmospheric rivers, Mike, I think you mentioned there was something like 9, or maybe it was fewer than that. That's been the total for the winter, but
so just to add on to that, Zach, is the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. It's a operational research group out of Scripps had noted, counting 9 atmospheric rivers by the end of January. So in that kind of December, January period.
Right. And so Daniel Swain from Weather West, sort of asked the question, how unprecedented has this period been? Because it was a really wet period, and there's some exceptionally large totals, some record-breaking totals, San Francisco and other parts of California. And, he came up with, over this 3-week period, more or less probably 4 analogs, a 3-week period in 1995, another one in 1969, another one in 1998, and 2017 as well in January. So this wasn't the wettest 3-week period on record, but it's up there. And when you look at sort of its impacts, aside from the flooding that occurred and wind damage and whatnot, and it did quite a bit of, including the loss of life. I mean, these are pretty big, devastating, impactful storms, landslides, and whatnot. But just in terms of sort of our snowpack conditions, in the beginning of February, I can do more up-to-date stuff in a minute, but the Sierras in the north were like 167% of average. The central Sierras were over 200% of average. The southern Sierras were close to 250% of average. On the statewide snowpack was over 200% of average. I'll update those numbers in a minute, but it's quite an impressive amount of water, Mike. And I'm wondering if you could do you recall sort of how this system set up and what might have been the drivers of this parade of storms?
Well, I think it I don't know if we talked about this earlier, but starting in November, a transition towards more pronounced trough off the West Coast. And it actually can be linked back to, there's been some bunch of moving parts, so La Niña is in the background, and that still largely has dominated the kind of the pattern across the Pacific Ocean. And it's been evident in having a strong ridge of high pressure up around Alaska in the northern Pacific. And so depending on where that ridge axis is, you're going to have a trough to the east of it. And so it had been just in the right spot that trough was off the West Coast. And then that trough being in the right position was able to pick up a lot of subtropical moisture in these long filaments. So those atmospheric rivers are going to play out not in the mean flow, but in the actual weather events that are kind of traversing in the jet stream pattern across the Pacific Ocean. And so just plenty of subtropical moisture getting funneled up into these storms. And the approach of those storms has been just perfect, far enough south to really hit square on California, and then sometimes drop further south to steer the moisture into the southwest.
So I think that's a really important point, because before we're talking about like the precipitation pattern not sort of having that canonical La Niña signature, and yet we're also talking about, well, La Niña did sort of hold. It was in the sort of background. And so what we're seeing here is, if I may, like the climate, the longer term, the average conditions actually did look La Niña like, but the weather within the climate produce these events, in particular, a stretch 3-week period of really wet conditions that overrun the precipitation La Nina signal such that it didn't look La Nina.
Yeah.
So it's the climate, the background is actually sort of behaving maybe how you would expect.
Yeah,
but the weather within that sort of caused the expression, the precipitation expression, the temperature expression to look a little bit different.
Yeah, I think the astute listeners will hear that we're having it both ways, which is exactly the point of this podcast, is to have it both ways. So,
I love that name. Can we having it both ways?
Having it always.
It's way more creative than the Southwest Climate Podcast.
It is. The climate science having it always.
That's the first task of our new producer. It's to rebrand us.
Okay, we do. We need new T-shirts. Okay, but just to put a finer point on what you're saying, yes. Okay. So when during a La Nina winter, when we're thinking canonically, right, everything's behaving like we expect it to. We will talk about those atmospheric rivers hammering British Columbia, right? Like if you think of that pattern, and if they're hammering British Columbia, we can have the orientation of that ridge axis give the Southwest warm and dry weather. But if you can imagine that whole thing kind of shifting just slightly, it would drop the track of those atmospheric rivers south. It's the same dynamics, but it's just like a subtle reorganization and a subtle shift of the dominant pattern. And it'll cause the anomalies to show up elsewhere. Kind of the same. You remember the Godzilla El Nino 2015, 2016, when we were looking for our, strong storms to pummel Southern California and Arizona, the opposite happened and the whole thing shifted north over the Pacific Northwest, right? So there's just subtle reorganization. It looked like El Nino largely, but just a little bit of a shift can cause the dominant impacts to move north and south, which is, you look at it in the stats and you're looking at all those past maps. You're like, the El Ninos, you kind of squint a little bit. They all kind of look El Nino-ish, and the La Ninas are the same way. They all kind of look La Nina-ish, and there'll be a couple ones that are like errant. And they're like, that doesn't look like the other ones.
Having it both ways. Beautiful, Mike. All right. So let me just do the sort of big picture snowpack conditions, because I think this is a really important story, particularly with what's playing out. If people are paying attention to the news with all of the articles on the negotiations or lack thereof that's going on with the Colorado River and the state of the Colorado River, right? Like we're in a situation where the string of dry winters and obviously the overuse of the Colorado, has put the water supply into dire situations. So we really need, and not that the problem goes away, it's just it buys us a little bit more time. We really need sort of a wet winter, and we're getting that right now. And it's also important to say that we need a wet winter that is not just slightly above average, but the runoff efficiency trend is also declining. That such that an average winter snowpack no longer produces an average stream flow runoff, and so you need to get much above average, not much above average, but above average to get average stream flow. So with that being said, it is a very rosy picture. So I'm looking at National Resources Conservation Service. They sort of monitor these high elevation sites across the West, a large number of them. You can get data on sort of point stations. I've done that for all of the ski mountains across the West. We'll do the ski report next time.
That's right. I'm excited.
But then they also do the sort of average conditions for basins. And the picture here is, if you can imagine those atmospheric rivers, the signature of the atmospheric rivers, the precipitation that we already talked about, just projected onto snowpack, it's very much the same thing. So, California, like I've already mentioned, a little bit, average snowpacks are a little bit less than I had talked about, because we're a week, I'm looking at data that's a week later than what I was reporting on before, and it hasn't snowed in that time period, but still, 150% of average or above. Like the Colorado River, let's say, most of the Colorado River basins are close to 175% of average. So let me look at let me get some numbers here. The upper Colorado River in Dolores is 159% of average. The upper San Juan is 120% of average. The lower San Juan is 150% of average. Going further south, the Little Colorado is 177% of average. The lower Green further north is close to 170% of average. Colorado headwaters, so this is far into Colorado, 126% of average. So really good snowpacks there so far. Not quite as good for the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande headwaters is about 96% of average, but hey, we'll take average, honestly. The upper Rio Grande, so the portion that's below the headwaters is about 100% of average. The middle Rio Grande is 102% of average. And really the hinge line is sort of the Colorado River Basin for the much above to right around average. So when you go north and you get sort of into southern Idaho and Montana and Idaho and Washington, it's right around average to slightly below average. But by God, you really have to go to I don't even know what this basin is, somewhere in Washington, Puget Sound. How about that to get to low 90% of average?
I see that too. Yeah. It's a good looking map, right? So a couple of things too, right? Is peak snowpack in the Southwest. So Arizona, New Mexico is March 1st. Peak snowpack for the Colorado River Basin, the upper basin, and further north is April 1st. So we're a couple weeks shy of March 1st for the Southwest. And I don't know, Zach, if you saw these, like the Little Colorado River Basin in Arizona is 185%. The Verde is at 354% of average SWE right now, snowpack. The Gila further south, which again it can really struggle during some winters, is 124%. And these are just really good numbers we have not seen in a while, kind of from the larger basin to the smaller basins across the region in Arizona, New Mexico.
So just to be clear, I have, maybe we're looking at different basin areas. Like maybe I'm looking at a smaller section, but I have the Salt at 124% of average, and I have the upper Gila at 100% of average.
What's the date of your, maybe I'm looking at a dated version of this. I'm looking at a data valid on February 3rd. So it's about a week old.
I'm looking at February 8th.
Okay. You got the updated. So that's interesting. So they've actually come down a little bit in the recent warm period.
They have come down just a little bit.
Okay. Good call. Thank you for correcting me there.
No, but the bigger picture that you're talking about, I mean, this is a, I don't want to say best case scenario, but it's pretty darn close to a best case scenario.
Yeah.
And again, like the temperature, the temperature, the below average temperatures are an important part of this story too, because the snowpacks are persisting, particularly at those middle range elevations. And that all bodes well.
Yep.
So skiers, I was just fooling around, and just being like, if I had to pick where I would go skiing, where would I go? And, so Snowbird for Utah is at it's in the 88th percentile. So 177% of average. Big Sky, further north, Montana, 84th percent of average. Schweitzer, believe it or not, I didn't know about this until last year when I was doing some research on this, but that's in northern Idaho. So that's like the only one where the snowpack is just a little bit below average that I came across. My favorite one, Kirkwood, Tahoe, right, is at its all-time record, 100th percentile right now. Heavenly is 98th percentile, also close to Tahoe. Mammoth, I don't have like percentiles for Mammoth, but its snowpack, its median snowpack for this time of year is about snow water equivalent is about 21 inches, and right now it's at 60. So boy, if you're a skier, you're loving this year. So good luck there.
Yeah, and if you like water, it's like a good thing too. Yeah. Right, so I was gonna update my Verdi. I'm looking at the same one, the February. This 269% of average for the Verdi. Still not bad. I mean, 2.5 times the normal amount of snow water equivalent for February. So, I mean, it is in the upper, I mean, it's starting to come down a little bit, but again, winter is not over yet. I mean, well, it's getting to be spring down here, but I don't know, man. What if we picked up a couple of more storms and stretch us out a little bit? We're going to be in pretty good shape. So let's actually talk about that in terms of short-term drought conditions. I think have largely been solved across much of Arizona. The longer-term drought, though, is still problematic. So the basins, the reservoirs in Arizona will do well with this. But I was looking at the streamflow forecast up on the Colorado. It does look like right now the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center, their forecast this was made today, and this is for Zach, you always have to help me interpret these.
I've got this data too.
You got it too? So are you seeing 117% of average at Lake Powell?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So what do you make of that number?
Okay, a couple things. So they do these probability of exceedance forecasts, which I think are quite handy. So the 117% of average forecast is for sort of like the 50th percentile exceedance, 50%. So it's sort of like the best guess, if you will. There's a 50% chance that it will be above 117% of average and a 50% chance that will be below.
Okay, so it's the middle of the road forecast.
Yeah, but okay. It's like obviously the higher that middle of the road forecast is, the better, right?
Yeah,
and often it's a lot lower, and I don't have the data for what it's been in the past couple of years, but clearly it hasn't been 117. So this is
I remember past years that being like 70%, 80% of average.
So when you look at like their probability forecast, there is 100% chance for them, like that the minimum flow, if you shut it all down right now, that the minimum flow, and I'm just going to use raw numbers here and I'll contextualize this. The minimum flow would be 4,340,000 acre feet. Okay. So just to put that in perspective, that would come in 60 years, that would come in as the 16th lowest flow on record. Okay. So that's pretty good.
So that there's 100% chance we're going to clear that bar.
Yeah. We're going to clear that bar or be at that bar according to these forecasts. Right. Yeah. And they're pretty good. But the point here is like in many years, like that number that's our bottom, that's our floor.
Right? Yeah.
And it's not even top 10 driest.
Yeah, that's good. That is good.
Conversely, like the maximum is let me see if I can do this quickly. The maximum would be the second wettest on record. So if everything goes bonkers, right, and the best case scenario plays out, the Colorado River Basin could experience close to the wettest or the most stream flows on record. Now, it's going to be in between those two things. That's yes. The important part. And it's like the best guess would be 117% of average. But I thought that was like a good way to think about it. I mean, we have a much higher floor now.
Yep.
And a much higher ceiling.
Yes.
And, these forecasts, they get better through time. And that's because more of the winter has already passed where we know actually what happens. And so we can we don't have to sort of do statistics for the unknown period, or we have to do statistics for a smaller duration of that unknown period because we just get further on in the season. So, Yeah. So the stream flow forecasts are, again, they reflect, a pretty widespread above average conditions across our high country in the West. And that's a really good sign. And again, I just want to emphasize, like, particularly for our astute listeners who pay attention to the water story, which is an important water story, and all the negotiations that are going on, like it doesn't solve that problem.
No. So, yes.
Yeah.
So that's like a key that I read. I read this yesterday. I thought was really interesting, is that there's no expectation for much change in Lake Mead's level this year, because the idea is that they're going to refill. It's not totally solved yet, but they were going to refill Powell first.
Yeah. There's like a Byzantine way that these reservoirs all manage each other. They're all like plugged in. It's very piped, plumbed system, and I don't quite understand all the nuances, but the main feature of the water supply situation is just that, like, we're historically drawing more water. There's more water allocated than, like, is in the river under normal conditions.
Yeah.
And so you'd basically, for the problem to go away, you'd almost have to have the opposite situation that we had for the last 20 years happen for the next 20 years.
I know. Isn't that, so that gets your head around, is like, we've got to do this winter probably 5 more times in a row.
Yeah. And if that's not happening.
No, it's not happening.
But what I think it does do, and maybe this is a good or bad thing, and I don't know, the people that, do these negotiations for a living can chime in, because sometimes it's really important to have people's backs against the wall where they actually have to make a decision. And so
for sure, yeah, this
may cause a little bit of the temporal anxiety to alleviate itself, and maybe that allows for a few more months of negotiation. I have no idea. I mean, I do know that this is high stakes kind of stuff, and
yeah.
So I'll leave it to those experts to deal with it. But
I felt like there was so much like cosmic Murphy law sort of like at play here, was like, of course you're going to end up having a wet winter at the crisis point, just to be confused, just to confuse and distract, because I think we've been overdrawing on the river, and those reservoir levels reflect that for a couple decades. Well, all of the decades. And then we've had the drought on top of it, and we've had the effect of climate change and the runoff efficiency. Is that this winter is fantastic and is going to do a lot of good for a lot of the landscapes. It's going to help some of the smaller reservoirs that are they fluctuate much more greatly. But the big ones, it's a drop in the bucket, largely, quite honestly.
Yeah. As you're talking, it made me think of some of the conversations that I've overheard or overseen on Twitter related to the drought, which you brought up before. And maybe it's just worth contextualizing this wet winter in the context of drought. As you mentioned before, we've seen a pretty good amelioration, as they say, improvement of drought conditions over the West, just in this winter alone, but also, from the generational, Mike, monsoon that we saw. But that's maybe reflecting sort of a one time scale of the drought, and the longer persistent drought that exerts impacts is probably still there. I don't know if you have anything else that you need to contextualize the current drought situation with. Maybe I'll say one more thing, which is, I think if you look at a time series of drought across the West from the U.S. Drought Monitor, there's these periodic periods. There's these periods of really heightened drought conditions, and we've been in one probably since early spring of 2020, and that peaked maybe around early winter 2021, and we've sort of been descending a little bit since then in terms of like drought coverage, both in terms of the severity and just in terms of its aerial coverage. So we're sort of, there's still a lot of drought present, like across the West, there's 35% of the West is painted with a moderate drought. So there's at least a moderate drought. So there's still pretty widespread drought, but it's a better situation than it has been since early 2020.
And again, like Arizona, we've got 2 seasons of precip, and we've been, crushing it with summer precip for two years in a row. And the winters have been not great. Not the driest in record. They bumped along. They've been below average. But we put together a wet summer and a wet fall and a wet winter in sequence. We haven't done that in a long time. So to me, that feels like it's solved a lot of short-term drought problems. And if it's anything, it's longer-term drought. But then even then, the longer-term drought starts to fade away. And, I'm looking at the drought monitor map, and there's a lot of areas under like severe to extreme drought that have just gotten hammered with precip this winter. I got to believe that map is on the move, and that, we're turning a little bit of a corner here. I mean, it could all go to hell again, right? I don't know. We've put a little bit of money in the bank here with some of the recent precip here in the Southwest, especially.
Great news. I love talking about the extremes,
Yeah, it has really been interesting. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how much do you think the drought story as reflected in these maps and the conversations behind these maps, like, are keying into the temperature story of the West? Or is it mainly driven by rainfall? Because I want to talk a little bit about the temperature. Yeah.
So you're saying if you look at the drought monitor map, how much of it is actually temperature?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is like we've had generally cooler, more mild conditions this winter, and like you could envision the same amount of rainfall falling under background conditions that were warmer, and that might. I guess it's the winter season, so there's 2 questions here. One is, does slightly elevated temperatures in winter dampen the improvements that otherwise would come from a really wet, or not so much? You sort of grimace.
Yeah, well, no, I don't know if we often have the sensitivity in some of our metrics, or even the way that we draw drought maps to know that nuance. Okay, so like this winter we were talking about earlier, we had a very, very heavy rain event in December with very, very high snow levels. And those are actually, they can be common during El Nino years. So you can end up having a lot of precipitation without snowpack. So is that useful, effective precipitation? I don't know. I mean, it is for some locations that don't rely on snowpack, but if you're building snowpack through the winter and you have less of it, then you can, and this is the concept that's come out in the drought community, is called snow drought, where we can end up having precip maps look fine, but you actually don't have snowpack reflected in them. And that snowpack is important because it is a water management tool to actually extend into the dry season later in the spring. So, and then there is the thing too about, you can have wet winters, good soil moisture recharge, very little snowpack that are effective, as long as you don't have periods of intense high temperatures with lots of sun that would actually evaporate out a lot of that too. So I don't know, man. Like, our tools are a bit clunky to get at some of this nuance. They're really good at precip anomalies and temperature anomalies, but putting them together into actual like soil moisture indices, they get a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about like some of those indices out there, like the SPEI. I'm forgetting the name.
That's right.
Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, right? Which I think I got that right.
Yeah, you're right.
Which try to wrap in both and you're sort of.
I worked with a grad student, right? Recently, Trevor McKellar, and we're working to get a paper out, but he modeled soil moisture across the Southwest. So this is not Northern Rockies, not California, it's Southwest. So our our regime, and he created actual soil moisture time series through a model because we don't have long records. He's got like 40 years of daily soil moisture modeled across the Southwest. And then what we did is we actually calculated drought indices, standardized precipitation index, just precip, and then SPEI, standardized precipitation minus evaporation, evapotranspiration index. We didn't find much difference actually between SPI and SPEI. They correlate a lot, and sometimes the temperature-based indices, depending on how they actually bring temperature in to estimate ET, can overdo it or underdo it. So they don't actually reflect land surface drying or wetting. So it's tough. You know, we use these simple indices to try to get the temperature aspect, and I'm not sure we get it right much of the time.
That's good. But I did want to talk a little bit about temperature because there's been a few cases this winter, and particularly in in the East Coast. You know, we've heard these like really severe outbreaks of cold. We've heard things like sudden stratospheric warming and polar vortex like always comes into play. We also had one earlier in the winter for us, like not for us in the Southwest, but for us in the West. Like I'm recalling like a really frigid cold front that passed through like the Northern Rockies. I think it was in December.
Yep, December.
And I'm just curious, like about sort of the wintertime temperature can be driven by changes in the pressure gradients in the northern latitudes. Sometimes people might hear Arctic oscillation or North Atlantic oscillation, NAO. And so what's been the story there, Mike? And has that been something that you've been paying attention to?
Yeah. So you're not saying connect that to drought. You're just kind of interested with the temperature variability.
I've moved beyond drought.
Okay.
Let me clean that up though.
No, I'm good. I think I got it.
I was initially thinking about temperature related to drought in terms of like, because it's colder, like has that somehow led to more useful rain, which I think you talked about in the nuance of that. In the summertime, the corollary is right, like when we have hotter conditions, just the rainfall that falls does less work because it gets evaporated sooner. And in the winter, if you have cooler temperatures, particularly at the mid elevations, the snow is able to stay on the landscape longer, and so the soil moisture can become more saturated in the springtime because the snowpack is more persistent. So there is a relationship there, but maybe our metrics aren't that sensitive yet. So that was the sort of connection I was trying to make with drought.
Yeah.
Now I'm moving on to thinking about because one of the surprising features for me this winter has really been the relatively mild cold conditions across a large part of the West, and we've also seen events in the Northeast and again up in Montana where we had these really Arctic cold outbreaks that can do quite a bit of damage, if not leads to deaths and whatnot. So I'm just curious, have you been paying attention to the temperature part of this? Yeah,
totally. I'll do a little cleanup on my own here. So I'll clean up the drought, and I'm going to move to I'll do the drought temperature to the temperature. The drought temperature, again, just like you said, Zach, is like, cooler temperatures lead to lower levels of evapotranspiration, lead to, this kind of nebulous term of effective precipitation. It's just this idea of like, when it rains, is it actually going into the soil? Is it recharging soil? Can it turn into base flow in streams? Does it turn into water resources? Higher temperatures tend to have more atmospheric thirst, draw it back out. There are tools coming online. We're using more and more. There's one called the Evaporative Demand Drought Index. It's called EDDI, affectionately known as EDDI. And it's doing a better job at really a sophisticated way of tracking evapotranspiration throughout the year. And you can kind of see, at shorter time scales of like, was this an effective period with precipitation, or was it followed by a time when the weather pattern shifted and it got actually windy dry, and maybe it wasn't even warm, but just windy and dry by itself, it has the ability to pull that moisture back out of the soil. And this varies throughout the year too, with high sun angle and stuff like that. So, and again, if anybody's really interested, the drought.gov site has gone through a couple of iterations, got really nice interfaces and tools to quickly see a lot of this stuff. So I really recommend checking it out. So the temperature variability of this winter has been really interesting too. And we've talked in the past about something called the Arctic Oscillation, which is an index that basically measures how bottled up the really cold polar air around the North Pole is. If it's really tightly held in check by the polar jet stream, that's a positive Arctic oscillation. And then if that weakens and that cold polar air is allowed to spill south all around the northern hemisphere because of a weakening of the polar jet, we call that a negative AO. So this has been the winter of negative AO largely, and it's kind of followed in suit since late November, kind of gone up and down, but persisted largely negative in December and January. And NOAA noted that the most negative AO value in December since 1950 was actually recorded. So it was very negative, meaning that there was sloppy, cold polar air kind of spilling down to lower latitudes all over the place.
And I think I read, although I could have read it incorrectly, that the average AO in December was the most negative on record.
That's what I read too. Yeah. So, I mean, so it was clearly, and so again, if you can imagine that cold polar air is not being held tightly up around the poles, and it is allowed to spill south, then you can have these cold air outbreaks, which we have seen several times. They've happened all over the world, but they've happened in the continental U.S. And Zach, you alluded to this record cold front that occurred that was related to this negative AL occurred right before Christmas, if not over Christmas, where a cold front, which was, literally was this just heavy, cold pool of air out of Canada, started to barrel towards the southeast on the east side of the Continental Divide. And there were places, this is actually common in the Northern Rockies all the way down to the Front Range, like through Colorado, where you can have these fairly warm temperatures, maybe in the 40s, and then have the temperature drop 30, 40, 50 degrees Fahrenheit over a matter of hours. And I was telling you, Zach, earlier, I read that I think it was in Laramie, Wyoming, the temperature dropped from 42 degrees Fahrenheit to -9 in 2 hours. This happened in Boulder. There were people talking about, literally watching mercury thermometers like drop, which you shouldn't be able to see in real time. So yeah, it was really quite fascinating. And some of this cold air that spills down the Front Range will sometimes work its way back east in these strong easterly wind events across New Mexico in Arizona, because it's cold, heavy air and we're higher elevation, and it's trying to work its way back to the ocean. So we're actually going to have a wind event tomorrow, Zach, kind of similar, cold air coming down the Front Range. It's going to work its way back towards the east. It's going to spill through all of our passes. I was going to go for a bike ride tomorrow, Zach, through Reddington Pass. No way, because it's going to have a 40 mile an hour headwind. And that air is trying to go down to the Colorado River Valley out to the Gulf of California. So yeah, there's
a niche entrepreneurial opportunity here, Mike. You could do like forecast for bikers.
So, okay, there is an app for your phone that is a wind forecast for your bike rides.
Oh,
but it's not very good because it doesn't use high resolution forecasts. It uses the kind of coarse grid. And I was like, oh, this is spot on, except we need to develop one just for Arizona using the WRF forecast. Because I looked at the WRF forecast for tomorrow. That 1.8 kilometer grid cell is like, there's a gap wind that's going to be howling through Tucson tomorrow.
All right, quickly though, how far south do these cold incursions occur? Like we're sort of immune from them.
The reason we're typically immune from is that we're on the west side of the Continental Divide, and so most of that cold air is up in it's the Great Plains of Canada. And it spills south and is held in check by that. Occasionally, like the really crazy cold air events, if you get the trough in the right position and the cold air is deep enough, can spread west, like our crazy freezing event in 2011. They don't happen very often, but you need that kind of event. But that cold air, because it's heavy and it's close to the ground, will go all the way down through the Gulf of Mexico, and they even spill down south into the kind of southern Mexico and into Central America.
Wow, that's crazy.
I mean, it moderates the whole time. It's getting warmer, but it is a cold wind out of the north.
You see it in the anomaly maps. But why couldn't you have like an outbreak, like why couldn't you have a lobe of cold air to our west that sort of like descends from, let's say, that, Alaska, for example, and then like butts up against, the western side of the Rockies, or even like the coastal range, and then sort of like gets blocked there and moves down.
It totally can, and you just mapped out exactly how it would have to happen. It has to have an inland track the whole time, so it's got to come out of like Western Canada and drop straight south. It can't interact with the ocean at all, because if it does, it's going to bring moisture and it's going to warm it up. If it can drop straight south and stay like in the interior, kind of in the drop into the Great Basin and then move south, that's how we got our 2011 cold snap. It was that path, but it was bigger. It was the entire, like, all of Canada just dropped all of its air straight south, which is why we got the cold air too. Typically, it's got a little bit of an eastward kind of nudge to it.
All right, I'm looking at the time. We could probably do another hour on this, but
save it. Yeah.
Anything else? So I sort of went over hinted at a couple of my surprises, and I'll just restate them. Again, it's sort of like the coherence of, a mild winter across the West. The other thing that I found really interesting, that you sort of articulated quite well, was like that we have had this El Nino background condition that has looked like an El Nino. Sorry, not El Nino, La Nina.
The other one. Yeah.
Yeah. The other one. We have had the background conditions of La Nina, but we haven't seen that expression in the precipitation. So it's this nice little interplay between weather and climate, and how the two, you have to really think about the two in different ways, and they don't always align.
That's right.
And particularly the other thing that we didn't mention, it's like, also it's much easier in areas where you have more sensitivity to the to small changes in rainfall. Like if you have low average rainfall to begin with, it just doesn't take much rainfall or a few storms to sort of flip the anomaly pattern, so to speak. So it's like you constantly have to play these games of like thinking about it in terms of climate timescales and weather timescales, and just if you're looking at the expression, that might give you a false idea of the background conditions that are going on. So it's important to look at both. So anyway, those were sort of like the two interesting / surprise features that I was thinking about this winter. I don't know if there's any other ones that we haven't talked about or that you want to reiterate that you've been thinking about.
No, I think we've done a good job of kind of noshing on all those kind of different things. I think that end the discussion and maybe do a little bit of looking forward is that the Climate Prediction Center seasonal outlooks have really used the La Nina signal pretty persistently through the season to try to be like, well, our best guess is that it'll end up being drier than average because of the La Nina condition. And every time you look at an outlook out a couple of weeks, like there's the week 3-4 forecast or the month coming up or the upcoming season, it still looks like La Nina, right? So it's this idea that it's what you said, it's weather versus climate, is that, okay, so if we start looking out at climate timescales, even as we're trying to do these forecasts, the expectation is that we'll still settle back into a La Nina pattern. But as we've seen, it doesn't always do that. So, could we squeak out, some more precip in February and even March? It's certainly possible, but the forecasts still say, well, it'll probably fall back to La Nina, which will be drier than average conditions. Yeah.
So I'm looking at the models behind the North American multi-model ensemble, and, every single one of them, the Canadian model, a few of the US models, NASA, for example, NCAR, GFDL, NCEP, they're all that La Nina pattern, like dry southwest, drier than average southwest, wetter than average Pacific Northwest. I mean, there isn't a deviation from that.
It's because those models don't do weather very well. Like they don't aggregate weather up very well. They do the big scale stuff better than that.
But to bring back my Texas Hold'em metaphor, I would treat this as knowing one of the cards that you're holding. One of the 3 cards that I don't know, I think I know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good analogy right there. Yeah.
I think my 2 pair.
It might not work.
It's going to beat your high kings.
Yeah, it gives you an edge, right? But it doesn't mean you're going to beat somebody every time, right?
I'm a terrible poker player.
Oh, I am too. I am not a good poker player. Yeah.
So the ENSO forecast then, it's this is the time of year where it sort of wanes, probabilities pick up more for neutral conditions, and then we look forward to the fall and winter out for what the next event will do, and it's picking up on elevated chances for an El Nino. So that's what we've got on the horizon. Like we've always talked about, this is like a really difficult time for models to actually make these ENSO forecasts, the so-called spring predictability barrier. So we don't necessarily, we wait a little bit, Mike, to put too much stock in that. But honestly, just based on sheer statistics, like I'd be really surprised if we had a 4th La Nina in a row. So
I think everybody would be.
Yeah. Okay. So anything else on forecasts? Are you expecting like the winter to sort of, what we have left to look more like November than it did January?
Persistence forecast, maybe, persistence would mean that this kind of unsettled weather pattern that comes and goes, maybe we'll still hang on to it through March.
Yeah. And we should also say, we said this many times, but that like the ENSO signal doesn't really show up, for the Rockies, the Northern Rockies, the Middle Rockies, I should say, the Colorado, Utah, Wyoming area, sort of on that hinge line. So, which I always think is particularly in a La Nina event is good news, because, we want that snowpack to keep being laid, throughout the winter. So. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right. Fantastic, Mike. This was really fun. I can't believe it took us 2.5 months to do this. But really appreciate the time, and really appreciate everybody who's paying attention, and we'll get our act together, and we do want to bring our colleague, our colleague and longtime friend Ben on here to talk about all the cool stuff that he's now doing with the state of California related to climate and weather. So we'll see if we can't have a short segment of that in upcoming months, but we'll try to be more regular about this. And again, I was sincere about the offer. If anybody out there wants to work with us and do a little of the production side of things, you can send Mike or I an email, and that's easy to find online. So appreciate everybody, and have a good rest of your month. And until next time.
Yeah. Cheers. Thanks, Zach. Thanks everyone for hanging in there with us.
Crap. Did I hit record? Just kidding.
That's not funny, Zach.
Maybe Ben can squeak that in there. We'd
have to practice extreme Buddhist like detachment at that point. Be like, what was in this conversation?
Because I think that actually went pretty well.
It might not, like if we can pull it off pretty regularly, I don't think it would require a lot of editing.